Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling our conversations with the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We point out, of course, the deathbed edition because the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, especially with Song of Myself, now we are to passage number 3, is actually a little bit different in its wording, and we'll maybe try and point out one or two moments where that happens. Now, some like to group different numbers of these sections or poems of Song of Myself together in different ways. Just to remind, in 1855, when you opened up the very first edition, you didn't see a title of Song of Myself, and you definitely didn't see any kind of numbering. It was just like one to the next. In other words, it was really understood as just one long poem. Of course, by the deathbed edition, we have these numbers. Now, it is true that we're going to see some of contiguity between passage 3 and passage 4 that we'll get to in a while, from the talkers to the trippers, as this sometimes will be referred to in 303. Let's remind ourselves as well that if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, my assumption is that you've been with us through the inscriptions, 24 poems, through all 19 sections of starting from Paumanok, and that you were with us for the introductory comments of Song of Myself, as well as passages 1 and 2, that now sets up our reading of passage 3. Now, because this is a little bit longer section, I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but we'll just kind of begin to work right quickly through it as we work through our learning theory. He begins with this, I have heard, which will sound very much like what we heard a number of times in starting from Paumanok. Like, is it possible that I happen to hear that kind of tone is going to play its game all the way through Song of Myself as well? I've heard what the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end, but I do not talk of the beginning or the end. Now, right away, let's get out of the way that it's an interesting dance that Whitman had with what he calls here the talkers. Now, what he means, of course, are the intellectuals, the thinkers, the philosophers. In other words, those who he is in somehow maybe in competition with. Now, earlier already in Leaves of Grass, we've seen this sometimes acrimonious dance that he plays with those who sit on the well-filled shelves, as we heard it from it in an earlier text. Here, they're just simply the talkers. Now, there is a distinction, no question, that Whitman is playing with here as well, and we studied this when we play around with Hamlet, don't we, of the difference between talkers and doers. Notice here about the talkers, he says, I've heard of them, as if, for example, they were around, and maybe I kind of heard them doing their talking. Now, of course, we know when I heard the learned astronomer, what he means here, of course, is I've been around and I've heard these talkers, these lecturers. It's ironic, of course, that one of them is now speaking with you, right? And what is it that they were talking about? Well, they were talking about the talk of the beginning and the end. Now, no question, Whitman's audience would immediately have recognized he's talking Genesis to Revelation. That is the Alpha and the Omega. That is to say, the Judeo-Christian Bible that he loved so much, the King James 1611 version. Notice we're back still to this notion of Genesis. It's the beginnings. It's interesting the way Whitman is acutely aware at the beginning of Song of Myself, like he was aware in inscriptions and in starting from Paumanok, that he's still trying to set up the reader for these leaves of grass, as of course he will have titled this. Notice he will say, I have heard, but. Now, this is interesting because it's almost like what we say in our discussion of the Declaration of Independence, that great writers will often concede a point. That is to say, they'll say something with which the acrimonious audience will agree, and then they'll follow it up with the word but. Notice we're playing a similar game here. I've heard what the talkers talk about. All of this stuff about the beginning and the end. By the way, let's just point out, as I have said a number of times already, we can't really read 4 quartets, T.S. Eliot's classics, without, I think, a full appreciation of Leaves of Grass, even though he denied it. Eliot often denied it. I think it's pretty clear. I mean, what are the opening lines, if you will, of East Coker? In my beginning is my end, and then of course the last line of that poem is, in my end is my beginning. And the idea that time plays such a pivotal role here. Notice, Whitman will say, I do not talk of the beginning or the end. For Whitman, everything, because he learned this from his study of Emerson and of course Heraclitus, for Emerson, as well as for Whitman, everything is about, of course, that famous essay, circles. We've given a full lecture on it. Circles, everything's continuous. Everything is always cyclical. His study, Whitman's study of Darwin, will, of course, help to promote this idea. We're going to see quite a bit of Darwin here as well in this one. There was never, he says, any more inception. Of course, we're back to Genesis and the beginnings again. Then there is now. Now, this will sound very much like what he'll say later. In passage 46, I know I have the best of time and space, and was never measured and never will be measured. I tramp a perpetual journey, come listen all. We're playing the same game. This is Whitman's optimism. It says, I don't want to live too much in the past. The past is okay, but the new, the NEW, is the KNEW. That is to say, I'm aware of that. I don't want to live too much in the future, although I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what's coming. I'm far more interested in this present moment right now. So notice he'll say it this way. He says, there was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now. The present is the perfect time, in other words, and will never be any more perfection than there is now. Notice this repetition of the word now. Nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. We can't, read these lines without thinking, of course, of our Dante and as old school, and our Jean-Paul Sartre's no exit, hell as other people, as the more newer school, right? In other words, everything comes down to the present moment now, which of course will remind us, and somewhat ironic, that another great poet of a similar time here in Burns in his To a Mouse makes that observation that we talk about in a lecture on LearnStrong.net, that the mouse, immediately after his house is destroyed, immediately goes and starts building a new house. Why? Because he doesn't know about the past and the future. The mouse only knows the present. And for Burns, he wishes that he could be more like that mouse, because the plow is always coming. This is that romanticized notion. Everything is assumed in this present moment now. Let's learn to live here more regularly. And that's where he will begin now, passage 3, as he responds to the talkers, to the philosophers. Urge and urge and urge. Notice we're going to get 4 of these urges. Urge and urge and urge always the procreant urge of the world. Now go back to our inscriptions lectures and to Eidolons. There it was the old urge. Later, when we get to pent-up aching rivers, we're going to hear about the muscular urge. This notion of urge is central. It's a Darwinian idea, and for Whitman, as we've said before, everything is kind of procreant. Everything is imbued with a certain kind of potentiality and energy. And it's always happening all the time. Now, think about the ways that this works. I mean, it's almost like an extended simile all the way through Leaves of Grass for Whitman. Yes, it is true that there is this powerful urging that's happening in the world, we'll call it history. But there's also, for Whitman, this powerful thing that's happening in America and, of course, in his Leaves of Grass. In other words, there's this notion of growth, dynamism, and there it is in the title, right? Grass and Leaves of Grass, right? Notice the word always. We're going to come back to it in the next little stanza. Always. In other words, it's ever going. It's ubiquitous. It's always happening. And then he plays the game of Genesis itself. Out of the dimness. Yeah, right? I mean, go back and look at the opening lines of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Out of the dimness. Opposite equals advance. We can't help but think of our Blake Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and of course the Taoist idea of the yin-yang symbol as well. Then we're back to always. Always substance and increase, always sex. Now, this word sex is going to jump right off the page in 1855. Really, he's just playing the Darwinian game of the survival and the struggle for survival of a species that must copulate. As we've said it before, and it's an irreverent kind of way to say it, but for Whitman it's the most self-evident, it gets dark at night, obvious way to say it. You're sitting here because two people hooked up and exchanged fluids. That's how you got here. In other words, it is always happening, it will always happen. Notice he comes back to another always a knit of identity. Now I am convinced that there are few writers more influential for Whitman in Leaves of Grass than Homer, and few texts more influential than the Odyssey. I think he loved the Odyssey more than he loved the Iliad, and it's fairly clear why. There's such a weaving that happens. Go back to our lectures. We gave full lectures on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and what do we say about the Odyssey? One of the central motifs is that weaving motif. It's constantly there, that knitting motif, that bringing together, right, strands of disparate, often seemingly disparate kinds of ideas to create a common whole. A knit of identity, and of course we're back to the opening lines with this identity thing. Who am I? Well, I celebrate myself. Who's doing the celebrating? No, I am. Well, how can you be celebrating yourself then? I mean, the eyeball can't see itself. And again, we start to play around with these multiple Whitmans as we talked about it. A knit of identity, and then we're to the fourth of the always. Always distinction. In other words, even though they're the same, they're different in some strange way. Always distinction, always, and now we're back to sex in a different phrasing, a breed of life. Notice above how he finished the two lines with the word now. Here, instead of finishing both lines with the word sex, he just says sex and breed of life. But he's playing around with similar kind of ideas. If anaphoria, of course, is played at the beginning of lines, Whitman loves to often have the same word or the same concept at the end of lines. And once you start looking at it, you go, oh, it's on. What do we call that? Well, for Whitman, we've already used the word echo. And as we study T.S. Eliot, My Words Echo Thus in Your Mind from Bert Norton, we're going to play a similar kind of game. But it's those echoes that we're going to hear over and over again. It's like a bell that's echoing. Then he moves on. To elaborate is no avail. Now he's saying this to the talkers, right? The entire passage is going to be to the talkers. I mean, in passage 4 in a little bit it's going to be to the trippers, but now it's to the talkers. And he says, to elaborate is no avail. We'll come back to this idea when I heard the learned astronomer. In other words, put it in your notes. This is what Ken Wilber will call, and others of the integralist school, the translinguistic nature of so much of what we come to know. We know it, we just can't really talk about it. It's no point. It doesn't matter to try to elaborate. Learned, notice your elided verb here, to try and capture the American vernacular. So the E is dropped with the apostrophe. Learned and unlearned feel that it is so. Now this learned and unlearned is central, because obviously the talkers think they're learned, but in fact Whitman's going to qualify them as unlearned, and immediately, some of you even smiling now as we say it, yes, you're right. We are back to Socrates, who always sits on the shoulder of Whitman as he's writing these lines. He sees himself as, of course, the American Socrates. And what is it that Socrates always pointed out to his Athenians? You think you know stuff, you don't. The thing I know is I don't know anything. And to that degree, I'm unlearned, even though I'm far more knowledgeable than you are, because I know I don't know stuff. Notice here, either side of this camp, it doesn't matter. There are things we butt up against. We cannot elaborate. All we can do is experience in the present moment. Then he goes on. Sure, and by the way, just hear the word sure as it relates to the word urge, right? Can you hear some of the beautiful tonal qualities at 2b? Sure as the most certain. Now we got an interesting simile here. We're going to get another simile later. And I think really in Whitman's mind in passage 3 and 4, he's playing around very much at the beginning of Song of Myself with the opening of the great epics, especially the Iliad and the Odyssey. Of course, the Aeneid is there as well. And so we got these similes that will start to play out, these comparisons. And so, sure as the most certain, sure, plumb in the uprights, well entreated, he's going to use a carpenter's term we'll talk about, braced in the beams, stout as a horse, affectionate, haughty, electrical, I and this mystery here we stand. And of course, the here we stand makes us immediately think of Luther, right, at the Diet of Worms. So he's playing around with some interesting stuff here. Let's work through it. Notice, first of all, even though it's translinguistic and there's no point to be able to elaborate on it, it's sure, as the most certain sure. It's a fun way to say it, sure as the most certain sure. In other words, it's the one thing you cannot argue against. Go back to Eidolons and the way he played that game in the inscriptions passage. And then he uses some carpentry language, which is fun because he's mentioned carpenters already in I Hear America Singing. And Whitman as person, we're reminded, his father was in fact a carpenter, and Whitman himself was a carpenter. So he's going to use some word imagery and language that will resonate for builders, if you will. Notice he calls it plumb in the uprights, well entreated, actually the very language, it's cross-braced, right? Well entreated, braced in the beams. In other words, the thing that we know that is absolutely certain, even though we can't articulate it so well, is stout as a horse, affectionate, haughty. This is an interesting word for Whitman. He'll come back to it. It means confident. Electrical, I sing the body electrical, actually be some of the important lines of Leaves of Grass. In other words, there's some kind of chemistry involved, so almost like combustion. And then he goes back to the opening lines of Song of Myself. I and this mystery. Again, you can't elaborate it. It's translinguistic. It's an enigma. Here we stand. Notice, before we were lying in the grass loafing. Now we're standing. In other words, we're confident, we're sure in this present moment, even though we can't really explain it or talk about it. And then he makes this really enigmatic set of lines. There's two of them that sit off. They're quite fun. And some students have enjoyed memorizing this and kind of using it in jest. Lacks one, lacks both, and the unseen is proved by the seen, till that becomes unseen and receives proof in its turn. Now, it's fun. It's almost like a Zen koan, right? For those of us who have already been exposed to some of that stuff. Go back and we've talked about that at Learn Strong as well. Notice, if you take one away, the other goes away. If you put one back, the other is already there. Lacks one, lacks both. In other words, I hand you a quarter and I say, I want the head side but not the tail side. That's not the way it works. I can show you the head side, but the tail side is still there. In other words, there's always both sides of the argument. This is a fun philosophic way to play the game. Lacks one, lacks both, and the unseen is proved by the seen. This, by the way, is a very interesting theological argument. St. Augustine himself would play this game in Confessions. Go back and take a look at our comments on that one. Till it's almost as if we're looking forward in the argument to a moment. That becomes unseen, that is to say the seen, and receives proof in its turn. Now notice we got proved and proof in these two lines. In other words, as we said in our discussion of starting from Pomenon, it is clear that Whitman feels he is being tested. He's being tried. He's on trial. And he has to validate. He has to prove. He has to say, Leaves of Grass is my proof for my what? Optimism, my certain view of the world, my understanding epistemologically of a fallibilist position, my understanding of ontology, we're working through our big five here obviously, my understandings of what it is that psychologically and sociologically moves us, motivates us, what are our fears, what are our motivations, and finally, of course, the question of theodicy and evil, and we're going to get to that now here in a second. He will almost reinvent this. It's almost like an echo when he comes back one more time and he says, showing the best. By the way, see all the ing words in this little phrase here. Showing the best and dividing it from the worst. Age vexes age. By the way, for the first 4 editions of this poem, there was a comma between worst and age. So it would be showing the best and dividing it from the worst, comma, age vexes age, comma. But the comma was removed by the deathbed edition so that it can be read 2 different ways. Showing the best and dividing it from the worst, age vexes age. It's an interesting way. So worst age can come together actually in 2 different ways. Knowing the perfect fitness and equanimity of things while they discuss, I am silent. and go bathe and admire myself. Now obviously this bathe and admire myself takes us back to passage 2, and it's obviously a pretty radical thing to say while everybody else is talking, for example, about love or God or whatever, right? Democracy. You remember those 3 things he said he most essential in starting from Paumanok, namely love, democracy, and religion. He says, while the talkers talk about all of that, I'm silent, and then I decide to go bathe and admire myself, which is, of course, a very radical thing to say. And of course, think about the word bathe. I hope that you circled it in your edition, because it's such a fascinating word. It can mean swim. It can, of course, in the Christian tradition as well mean some kind of notion of baptism. In other words, some kind of redemptive activity, right? Which carries with it all kinds of metaphoric implications. And this whole thing about admiration of oneself can mean, of course, look how amazing I am, but it can also mean I study, right? I'm alone with myself to try to figure things out. Notice all of the ing words here: showing, dividing, knowing, right? But he says showing the best and dividing it from the worst, age vexes age. In other words, this is what philosophers have always attempted to do, and it doesn't work anymore. Whitman is the great, really, integral thinker. He says you can't do it. When you start making these kind of divisions and subdivisions, this is kind of maybe his criticism of Aristotle and all of his taxonomies, something is missing. You can know, he would argue, everything from Aristotle's Poetics and still miss the genius of Oedipus Rex. This is an interesting idea. Then he says, knowing, of course, here we are to our epistemological study, knowing the perfect, he loves this word perfect, fitness and equanimity of things. Right? In other words, there is a balance to everything. It's just that academics, we intellectuals who love to talk about all this stuff, we parse everything up so much that often there's nothing left to enjoy. He says the equanimity of things, while they discuss, and we're back to the antecedent of the talkers, right? He loves to do this, where he talks in the opening lines about a certain kind of antecedent, and then he'll come back to it with these pronouns like they. While they discuss, I am silent. Now, this is a key. We're going to come back to it again and again. He'll say that he sits and looks out at the world, and then he sees the pain and the suffering. This will be part of his theodicy, and he's silent. Of course, note the irony of him saying that he's silent.